Hello everybody, this is Kirby over yonder, and I think it's safe to say that Gravity Falls is one of the most well-liked cartoons from the past 10 years. Everybody loves this show, from Chimpanzee to Chimpanzee. But easily the most controversial aspect of Gravity Falls is the character of Mabel Pines. Ever since the show ended back in 2016, I've seen countless people try and criticize Mabel as a character. And while some of those criticisms were fair, I still didn't like seeing a character I enjoyed be criticized so harshly. Which is why I'll be using this video as not only a way to defend Mabel, but also as a way to try and understand a lot of the hate that Mabel gets. Because of that, I will be splitting this video into 3 parts. In part 1, I describe examples of why people don't like Mabel. In part 2, I give my own personal input on these examples, and whether or not I think they're valid. And in part 3, I justify why I think Mabel is a good character. Oh, and if you want to debate any of these points in the comments, then feel free to do so. Just as long as you keep things civil, it is just a cartoon after all. I won't be responding to any sort of personal attack on me, so please don't even bother. Oh, and in case you're wondering, yes, I have seen this video, and I will be discussing some of the points brought up in it. However, I don't actually have anything against this video or the person who created it. I actually think it's very well put together and constructive. They even made a follow-up video discussing many of the criticisms that people had with the original video, as well as Mabel's apology in the Lost Legends comic. Both videos are very good, and I recommend checking them out. Oh, and speaking of which, yes, I have read the Lost Legends comic, but I won't be using it or any other Gravity Falls media outside of the show itself as evidence in this video. Yes, I know it's technically canon, but a lot of people haven't read the comic, so I feel kinda weird about using it as evidence. I'd rather just stick to the show itself. It is a good read though, I recommend it. Okay, long intro out of the way, now we can finally move on to part 1. A lot of people's criticisms towards Mabel relate back to Dipper in some way, shape, or form. For example, she's frequently shown to be teasing Dipper. In Dipper vs. Manliness, she makes fun of his masculinity. In Little Dipper, she makes fun of his height. And in Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons, she makes fun of him for enjoying the titular board game. Dipper is also frequently shown to be making sacrifices for Mabel, such as the Time Traveler's Pig, in which he sacrifices his chances to get with Wendy in order for Mabel to win Waddles, the Deep End, in which he sacrifices his job as a lifeguard in order to save Mermando, who Mabel had recently fallen in love with, and Weirdmageddon Part 2, in which he sacrifices his apprenticeship with Ford so that he can grow up with Mabel. People in general really don't like how upset Mabel got when she heard of Dipper's apprenticeship with Ford, claiming that she is needy and possessive of Dipper. People also don't like how she trusted Stan over Dipper in Not What He Seems. Mabel has also been accused of just being generally selfish even towards people who aren't Dipper. In episodes such as the Truth or Consequences short in the Bottomless Pit episode, Mabel forces Stan to tell the truth by giving him truth teeth. There's also Boys Crazy, in which she forces the Several Times Band to stay with her for much longer than they need to, and The Love God, in which she makes Robbie and Tambry fall in love with each other without undoing the potion. But probably the main reason why people hate Mabel as a character is for accidentally giving the rift to Bill, thus starting Weirdmageddon. As you can see, there are actually quite a few reasons as to why people don't like Mabel Pines. But how valid are these criticisms? Let's find out. I admit, I've always found the whole Mabel teases Dipper all the time complaint to be just kinda petty. Like, yeah, they're siblings. Of course they're gonna tease each other, it's what they do. Bart and Lisa fight with each other like all the time, and nobody complains about either of them being bad siblings. Plus, it's not like Dipper doesn't tease Mabel at times. In the episode Little Dipper, it's revealed that Dipper often rubs his victories in Mabel's face, causing her to feel inadequate in comparison. Which is why Mabel was teasing Dipper for being short earlier in the episode. Also, one last thing I'd like to point out, in pretty much every example of Mabel teasing Dipper, Stan is also teasing Dipper, often even more so than Mabel is, and he's a grown man. And yet I see nobody criticize him. Now it's time to talk about Dipper making sacrifices for Mabel, which I'd like to discuss on a case-by-case basis. In The Time Traveler's Pig, Dipper continually goes back in time in order to not mess up his day with Wendy. At one point he asks Mabel to help him, which ends up working out for Dipper, but makes it so that Pacifica wins Waddles before Mabel has the chance to. So after a few time travel shenanigans, Dipper goes back to screw up his day with Wendy so that Mabel can win Waddles. First off, people accuse Mabel of guilt-tripping Dipper in this scene, but that's clearly not the case. If Mabel had been out here for like a day or two, then yeah, maybe. But the fact that she stands out here for at least a month shows that she's clearly just genuinely depressed about losing Waddles. She isn't trying to manipulate Dipper here at all. Also, if we're gonna call Mabel selfish in this episode, then maybe I should point out that Dipper literally manipulated with time itself in order to get with a girl who's clearly too old for him. Oh, and that's the other thing. Even if everything went perfectly fine with Wendy, she still probably wouldn't have wanted to date him, and it would have been kinda wrong if she did, considering their age difference and all. All Mabel wanted was her damn pig back, and I don't think there's anything unreasonable about that. Moving on to our second example, we have the deep end, where Dipper sacrifices his job as a lifeguard in order to save Mermando. Now, I will agree that there was no real reason as to why Mabel had to use the pool cooler and megaphone as opposed to just finding others, but I consider this more of a plot contrivance than a reason as to why Mabel is a bad character. And she is ultimately doing good in the end by saving Mermando's life. Oh, and keep in mind, the only reason as to why Dipper wanted to be a lifeguard in the first place was so that he could hang out with Wendy. And by the end of the episode, Wendy gets fired too, so it's not like Dipper actually lost much. And for the third and final example, we have Weirdmageddon Part 2, in which Dipper gives up his apprenticeship with Ford in order to go back home with Mabel. First off, it's stated by Bill in the episode that Mabel's bubble is putting her under some sort of spell. A spell that clearly affects the way that she thinks. Under normal circumstances, Mabel probably would have just left the bubble without making much of a fuss about it. But due to her mind being manipulated, she needed a bit more convincing. This is even evident by the end of the episode, where Mabel tells Dipper that she'd be okay if he stayed at Gravity Falls with Ford. I know many people say the scene was rushed, but considering the fact that Mabel was physically incapable of thinking clearly up until that point, I don't have much of a problem with it. I also just don't think Dipper staying with Ford would have been a good idea. Sure, Ford was a pretty amazing guy who did a lot of cool things, but he was also extremely lonely and pushed a lot of people away. And this lifestyle is ultimately what led to Ford being stuck in a portal for 30 years. I don't think living this way would have been right for Dipper, especially since he's still just a kid. Much like Mabel, he needs to be able to grow up and mature a little bit, and then he can investigate the paranormal if he still wants to. As far as Mabel trusting Stan over Dipper goes, this is probably the criticism I understand the least. She's literally a 12-year-old girl being put in a life or death situation where she has to choose between the two people she loves most. Do you really expect her to make a rational decision here? Throughout the entire episode, everything Mabel thought she knew about Stan was being questioned. So in her mind, choosing to trust Stan was her last chance to prove that he is not actually a bad guy. Oh, and also Mabel was right in the end. People kinda seem to forget that detail. Now time to discuss the examples of Mabel being selfish to other people. With the Truth Teeth situation, sure it wasn't right for Mabel to manipulate Stan this way, but at the same time it's pretty easy to understand where she was coming from. Stan literally does illegal things all the time and lies about them. That's pretty concerning. He also stole Dipper's spaghetti, that son of a bitch! And in all fairness, Mabel does learn her lesson in the end, that lying is okay sometimes, so it's all fine and good. As far as the boy band situation goes, yes, Mabel definitely went too far in keeping the boys with her for much longer than she needed to. But again, Mabel does learn her lesson in the end and sets the boys free. And in all fairness, Mabel did save the boys from their evil producer, so while she definitely wasn't completely in the right, she did ultimately do a good thing in the end. And as far as the Love God episode goes, yeah, I don't really have much of a defense for this one. It's always kind of rubbed me the wrong way how Mabel brainwashes Robbie and Tambry into falling in love with each other and just doesn't do anything about it. Like, sure, they're happy, but how do you know it's real happiness, you know? I don't know. The Love God is definitely one of the weaker episodes in my opinion. I'll give you this one, Mabel haters. And to end part 2, we have the biggest complaint people have with Mabel, and that is starting Weirdmageddon. Now, before I defend Mabel here, I will agree with Mabel haters on one thing. I do believe that Mabel starting Weirdmageddon should have been acknowledged in the show at some point in Weirdmageddon Part 2 or 3. It kinda rubs me the wrong way how in Part 1, Dipper and Ford just kind of assumed that the rift cracked in Mabel's backpack and they're never really corrected on that. I'm not saying she needed to be seriously scolded or anything, I just wish that they'd at least talk about it. That being said, I still don't think Mabel is a bad person for giving Bill the rift. Here's why. While I do think it was irresponsible of Mabel to give Bill the rift, I do also believe that Ford deserves a good chunk of the blame as well. He was the one who told Dipper not to tell anybody about the rift. If he had just been upfront with Mabel about the rift from the start, then Weirdmageddon probably wouldn't have happened. And again, it was definitely irresponsible of Mabel to give the rift to Bill, but considering the mental state she was in at the time, I don't exactly blame her. This was moments after pretty much everything in her life came crashing down, so much like with Not What He Seems, it's not exactly fair to expect Mabel to make the most rational decision here. She had a completely understandable moment of weakness, and I don't think it's fair to call her a bad person because of it. But that being said, why do I think Mabel is a good person and a good character? Well, allow me to explain myself in part 3. When defending Mabel, a lot of people argued that she is still a child and is allowed to be a little immature, which in my opinion is a valid argument. However, a lot of people rebuttal by saying that Dipper is the same age as her and is more mature. But is he though? Sure, on surface level he may seem more mature, but in reality he can be just as, if not even more immature than Mabel at times. I already talked about the time traveler's pig, but in general, Dipper's attitude towards Wendy was kinda creepy in season 1. He almost had this sense of entitlement to her, like she couldn't be with Robbie because she just had to be with him. In the inconveniencing, he lies about his age just so he could hang out with her. In Double Dipper, he clones himself just so he can prevent Wendy from getting with Robbie. In Fight Fighters, he generally just acts very entitled to Wendy over Robbie. In Summerween, he lies to Mabel about being sick so he can go to a party with Wendy. And in Boys Crazy, he asks Wendy to go bowling with him the moment after she breaks up with Robbie, showing no actual concern for her feelings. And even in Season 2, there are times where Dipper acts immature, such as in Scarioki where he literally raises the dead just to prove a point. In Sock Opera, he makes a deal with Bill despite knowing that he can't be trusted. In Roadside Attraction, he flirts with multiple different girls with no intent on ever talking to them again. And I'm not saying all this stuff because I don't like Dipper or think he's a bad character or anything, but rather to say that both Dipper and Mabel are flawed people, and that their flaws make them more interesting and well-rounded. Imagine how boring the show would be if Dipper and Mabel were just these goody two-shoe kids who did nothing wrong. Like, no, they're kids. They're allowed to be a little selfish and annoying and immature at times. Just let them be kids. And for as much as she can be selfish, there are plenty of times where Mabel has been shown to do good things for others. In Headhunters, she made an entire wax statue of Stan, which she apparently put a lot of effort into. In Dipper vs. Manliness, she helped Stan get ready for his date with Lazy Susan. Similarly, in Fight Fighters, she helped him get over his fear of heights. As mentioned before, in The Deep End, she helped save Mermando's life. In Dreamscapers, she helped get Bill out of Stan's mind, even after Dipper had temporarily given up. In Seuss and the Real Girl, she helped Seuss find a girlfriend. In Blendon's Game, she helped compete in Globnar so Seuss could reunite with his father. And in The Last Mabelcorn, she helped get the unicorn hair to protect the shack against Bill. That last one is especially important because if Mabel hadn't done that, then there's basically a 0 chance that anyone would have survived Weirdmageddon. And as far as her relationship with Dipper goes, while we do often see Dipper making sacrifices for her, there are 2 major times in which we see Mabel make a sacrifice for Dipper, and I think one of them says a lot about their relationship. With the most notable occurrence being in Sock Opera, in which Mabel sacrifices her play in order for Dipper to get his body back. However, the more interesting example to me is in Carpe Diem, where after spending an entire episode fighting over this new room, Mabel just lets Dipper have it. But once he has it, he realizes just how bored and lonely he is without Mabel, and he decides to move back in with her. Because for as much as Mabel needs Dipper, Dipper also needs Mabel. Dipper's such a calculated and thought-driven person that he needs someone like Mabel there to say, hey, maybe don't think too hard about these things. The 2 balance each other out and, in my opinion, make for one of the most legendary cartoon duos of all time. 3 cheers to the Mystery Twins. Kirby, out.